Welcome to the Living Life Juicy podcast, where we explore how we can be present and kind as we do great things. I'm your host and guide, John Losey. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to tell you about some other things that you can check out. The Growing People podcast on YouTube is where we provide resources and insights on how people and groups develop. You'll find short explainer videos on lots of different topics. So check out the Growing People podcast. Other is intowisdomgroup.com, where we guide people and groups to their next best step towards growth and sustainability by designing experiences and resources to develop professionals and organizations. Lastly, The Pottery Panda is a business fable about strategic planning, and it's being released on April 22nd, actually a day after recording this podcast. You can get your copy at potterypanda.com. So today's guest is Lucinda Martinelli. She's another pandemic blessing, as I call them. We met while doing some online conferences and bonded over talking about facilitation. Lucinda is the creator and director of Whole Planet Consulting. She's been creating and leveraging teachable moments since 1991 and holds a master's degree in experiential education from the University of Wisconsin. But I want Lucinda to tell a little bit more about who she is and what she does. So Lucinda, welcome.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation because we've talked a lot about this stuff in the past, but I really think your journey and the way you look at things fits with Living Life Juicy about being present and kind as you do great things. So my first question to you is to flesh out your bio a little bit. How do you explain what you do to other people?
So I usually start by saying that I wear a lot of hats. So I'm a lead facilitator at the University of Michigan Adventure Leadership Program. And what I do there is I facilitate adventure experiences for them, but I also mentor and train their interns. So we get undergraduate and graduate level interns every year, and I help with their training. I also am a trainer for a ropes course builder or professional vendor member of ACCT, Experiential Systems, and I am the creator and director of Whole Planet Consulting. I just finished my journey as a grad student, so
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It was quite the thing, and we'll probably be talking a lot about that today. So that's how I explain what I do. When I talk about my business, Whole Planet Consulting, I say that I teach people to create and leverage teachable moments. And that's a way I've found to encapsulate what I do as a facilitator, but also what I do as a trainer and someone who teaches other people about facilitation. Facilitation can be kind of squirmy and squishy. It can be a little difficult to facilitate, to describe, especially for people who aren't familiar with the practice of facilitation. So that's how I've tried to encapsulate for educators in particular.
So before we get into facilitation and that stuff, you said that you facilitate adventure programs. Mm-hmm. What is an adventure program?
An adventure program is really anything where, at its core, adventure is an experience where the outcome is uncertain. And the journey to get there could be full of risk in many ways. So the adventures that I facilitate have to do with high ropes courses, low ropes courses, climbing tower, and team building is what we focus on the most. So those are things that people are often familiar with, but adventure can take the form of trips and that kind of thing. Adventure leadership does that. I do not do trips anymore. I've done that. I'm very happy not to do that so much anymore.
I know you work with teachers. So
mm-hmm.
how does adventure translate into a classroom?
So that's a really big question. And we could probably have about 5 conversations about that. So the classroom learning should be an adventure. It should be a journey where the outcome is really unknown, and it should be fun and exciting to do. I think too often in the classroom, it's more defined and it's more stepwise and it's more kind of, how do I want to say, the steps are even defined. Like here's, you do this step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and all of those steps are really defined and very narrow. If learning is an adventure, then the learning is a little less, the outcomes may define, but how you get there may not be.
Well, and I love the idea of the outcomes of learning aren't defined, because it truly is. If we're going to be continuous learners, there is no defined specific outcome. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but if you know the outcomes of learning, it's not learning, it's regurgitation. And you're just kind of spewing it back, as opposed to if you're facilitating an adventure in learning, it's like brand new. And for the teacher or for the facilitator, there's still some things that are brand new, but for the most part, it's predictable. But for the learner, man, it's wide open to outcomes.
Yeah. So my perception of teaching and those outcomes and how defined they can and should be has changed over the course of my master's work. I've been delving into teaching and facilitation competencies. And it is actually important for teachers, and what they're being asked to do is to have a specific outcome. And that outcome doesn't necessarily have to be regurgitation. It can be the demonstration of understanding of something. If education is that adventure that we want it to be, that demonstration can and should be defined more by the student. So it may be you can evaluate a student's learning equally well if they make a video, write a song, take a test, write an essay. Like there's a lot of different ways to assess their learning and to figure out if you've if you've reached the outcomes that you need to reach. Those outcomes can be very specific, but it doesn't have to be just regurgitation.
Yeah. And before we geek out on facilitation, learning outcomes, all that kind of stuff, tell me a little bit about your origin story. How did you get to where you're at right now? What kind of path did you take?
Boy, my path has been, my path itself has been an adventure. Let's just say. So in my schooling, when I was in, middle school, high school, my mom's a teacher. My dad did some teaching, so I thought I was going to be a classroom teacher. That was kind of what I assumed I was going to do. I went to school and I was a music major, and my path was to be a music teacher, vocal music teacher. And in my 5th year of my undergraduate, I decided that was not what I wanted to do. I was all set up to do my student teaching and decided that was not what I wanted to do. So I didn't do my student teaching.
So your voice was your instrument? Is that the?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I went to the career office at the college and went, so I just decided I hate my major. So now what do I do? And they said, well, what do you like to do? What do you want to do? I was like, well, I know I want to teach something, but I don't know what, and I don't know what level. And they said, well, we'll look out for something for you. And so I saw a kind of an advertisement for Nature's Classroom, which is a program in New England that still exists. And their mission is to teach students to live together in harmony with each other and with nature. And I was like, well, great, that sounds like fun. And they took anyone with any major, any background. So I did that for a year and a half, and I spent a year and a half waking up in the morning going, I don't believe they pay me to do this. It was so fun. I learned a lot, and but it also was a residential program. So the kids came in on Monday, left on Friday. And so it was hard to have a life outside of it. And I knew that that's what I wanted. So I was like, well, I'll go back and get certification to teach science. Science stuff is really cool. You get to play with all the cool toys and all that kind of stuff. So I did that, but I wasn't finding jobs right away after I graduated. So I was like, well, I went to camp at this place. They did some outdoor education stuff. I can do that for the time being, for now, until I find a real job. So I did, and I went back there, and 18 years later, I was still there, still never having had a real job.
I worked full time at camps as well, so I knew we had something there. That's kind of my foundation and my tribe is the camping world. And I always had to explain to my parents, no, this is a real job, and I'm making money and all that kind of stuff. It's okay, even though I did get to, play with kids in the outdoors all the time.
Well, it's funny because I never thought of it as a real job. My boss also didn't think of it that way, but that's a different episode. But it wasn't until after I left that job that I had any idea I was part of a field, that other people did this and had real jobs doing this. I just thought it was something I did kind of for fun, and earn a little bit. But I had no idea I was part of something larger until a couple of years after I left that job and went to a conference and was like, oh, there's people who have like full-time jobs and they still do, either outdoor stuff or they're doing something that's experiential. And even that term experiential education was new to me. And that point really changed everything. I met some people that you and I know, some mutual friends of ours I met that day that I walked into that conference, and changed the trajectory of everything and has led to everything I've done since.
So I'm curious because my background in biology, and now I work mostly with businesses and things like that. I still do experiential things, and I view the way that I lead workshops as adventure programming. It's just that it tends to be with people in coats and ties and not harnesses. So I found ways. I've got an undergrad in biology, and that informs about how I do my stuff today. Is there anything from your music background that informs how you do your practice today?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that in a long time. Well, the major function of my music background has been to raise my children. So my children are very musical, much more musically gifted than I ever was. But it allows me to have conversations with them about music theory and that kind of thing. I think there are some ties, but I haven't really thought about bringing them in until recently. So in the experiential world, in the adventure world in particular, often I have a group of people and we're approaching some task or some obstacle or something. And often I'm just asking them to just jump on this thing and do it. And what I've realized recently is that they may need practice. They may not have encountered this thing before, and they may need practice on it. And that's okay. It's okay to let them practice. They can still do the task that I'm asking them to do as safely as possible and all of that. And it's okay to let them practice. It's also become a topic of conversation when we're done with those activities. How did you get better at this? Oh, we had to practice. And so I bring that into, if you're playing a musical instrument or if you're writing essays or doing math problems or whatever it is, you need practice. And that concept is starting to shape how I talk with teachers as well. We don't need to formally assess every single thing that our students do. They need practice before they have that formal assessment. And it's okay if they don't do so well on the practice. Like that's where they learn how to do it well. So I haven't really thought about that as a musical thing, but I guess it kind of is.
And I want to get back to the music piece, but when you're like, I would see as a teacher, facilitator, somebody who's impacting the growth of somebody, I think assessment is a key role, but even more important is being that creating opportunities for guided practice, not just any kind of practice.
Mhm.
That's the myth of that 10,000 hours thing. It's accurate, but it's a specific kind of practice, not just 10,000 hours of practice that you need to get. And that means doing it and getting feedback and guidance and getting an opportunity to do it more than once. And I think creating those spaces in the classroom or in a learning environment. In fact, I think that's part of what defines a learning environment, is that. Now, back to the music thing, I'm going to throw out a phrase that you hear in both of our, I think, especially in vocal training, but also in our facilitation education stuff, and that's finding your voice.
Hmm.
How is that done? Like when you're training a vocal person and also working with a group, where's the meaning in that?
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question. As a music vocal major, at least at the time that I was coming up through, that was not a discussion we had. I wish it were, but it was not. Also, at some point, someone gave me a challenge to sing something no one else that I had not heard before, and I was unable to rise to that challenge. That's just not the way I think musically. I think about playing things that other people have played and that I've heard before. I mean, kind of getting back to the idea of practice too, it wasn't until I had someone who could teach me how to practice that I actually made progress in my musical endeavors.
How did they teach you? What was kind of the secret to how to practice?
So it was breaking up into small pieces. It was starting at the end and working toward the beginning. And it was, those really small pieces were really crucial. There's a technique where you take a phrase that you're working on, and you start at the end of the phrase and you just play that one note, and then you play the last two notes, and then you play the last three, and then the last four. So you kind of build it from the front to from the back to the front. So that was a good technique. So yeah, until I had someone work with me on those techniques of practicing, I just made the same mistakes over and over and over again.
That gets into the type of practice that we're talking about, because if it's not that practice makes perfect, because if you're practicing poorly, you'll perform poorly.
Yep,
but
you're just going to practice those same mistakes over and over and over again.
And then the following phrase is perfect practice makes perfect. But the problem with that is that you're not perfect when you practice. So the idea is getting better each time that you practice. And that only happens with a strategy for learning, and also with feedback, encouragement, and support as you walk through it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That feedback, encouragement, and support is so crucial, because at every point when you're learning something, so as a music major, I had to learn dozens of instruments. And every time I learned a new instrument, there was a point where you can play like Twinkle Twinkle and Hot Cross Buns, but you can't play anything that really sounds like anything for quite a long time. And you have to practice and you have to work at that. If you don't have that encouragement, support, and those ways to practice, you're going to put that instrument down. At least I did.
When it comes to skill building and learning, so when I worked at camp, I played guitar. I had a bunch of people who would always ask, "Hey, John, can you teach me how to play guitar?" And there was one particular guy who worked with me for a bunch of years. At the beginning of every summer, he'd say, "All right, this time I really mean it. Can you teach me how to play guitar?" We'd sit down and he'd want to be, Eddie Van Halen after one lesson. And then the next year, no, I really mean it. And he'd want to be Jimi Hendrix after one lesson. And finally, it's got to the point of, his name was Goose. And he'd say, "Hey, Goose, if you want to get good, you got to be willing to suck." And that idea of, two things come to mind. One is wanting that desire to be really good, but you've got to go through that season of sucking. So, and then it's just that that idea that once you start to gain skills, you can fight the Dunning-Kruger effect of thinking you have it down pat when you really don't, by having that same sort of imposter syndrome where you're always checking yourself and going, man, there's much more that I have to grow into. And the imposter syndrome is actually okay because it allows you to improve your skills and continue to see that there's more to learn. So I hear when you're talking about any of those instruments, it's going to be uncomfortable for a while. And then as you gain comfort, you start to see, oh, and there's more.
And I think part of that seeing that there's more is being part of a group of people who are learning with you. So learning in community, which has been the theme of my my master's program, is so important because learning by yourself, so practicing that instrument by yourself is horrible. It's boring. It's hard work. It's all those things. But if you're with a group of people who either are just a little bit farther down the road than you are, or maybe they're, experts, but they can talk to you like a normal human being, like they understand or remember what it's like to learn, and can be very encouraging and just accepting of where you are in the process. That's crucial to that learning process. That's what can keep you going through this part where you kind of suck. You may kind of suck, but maybe you can fit in, 4 notes alongside this, great player, or maybe you can, you can't improvise with your instrument yet, but you can play just the bare bones melody, or you can come in every, the first beat of each measure, whatever it is. If you have another group of people you're playing with, it's much more interesting. If you're doing that by yourself, it is just so awful.
So I did, when I was working at the large corporate university, we did a leadership conference and we brought in a maestro. He wrote the book Maestro. I'm blanking on his name right now. But basically it's leadership as being a conductor. Mm-hmm. And that they're all focused on one person. He gets them to start and they're able to do their own thing, but it's all together. And that's one picture of leadership. And then I was watching Ken Burns' documentary on jazz, and it got me to think about jazz as a leadership model or as a team model, which is, and I played on stage and that kind of stuff. And jazz, it's all about everybody being on the same page, but then allowing people to step up. And now you're in the forefront and everybody else supports. And then when it's time for somebody else to step up, somebody else supports. So I was learning how to play bass, and I was up on stage playing with a group of people, and it wasn't jazz, but we had that feel to the group I was with. And all of a sudden I'm just doing my simple bass line. And the guy who's leading it at that time, he turns to me and says, "Hey, John, do a bass solo." And so I just knew a scale. And I started doing a scale, and all these other people who are definitely good on their instruments backs me up. And that scale sounded like an amazing solo, not because of me, but the people who backed me up. And so I started talking about the type of, do you want to be a conductor or do you want to be in a jazz band as you design your team and that particular approach?
It's so interesting that you bring those metaphors into play, because as I've been doing research into facilitation and what it is, those 2 metaphors are metaphors that are used to describe facilitation and what facilitation is. So that's just so interesting that those 2 examples came up.
Well, especially I had this conversation about co-facilitation with somebody recently. And there's 2 different, when you co-facilitate, it's either, you can either truly get that jazz approach where you're blending and you're moving back and forth more often than not, and it's still okay. It's more like serial facilitation, where you take an event and I'll take an event, and then we run the debrief, and then you take over and you do your thing. And if I'm facilitating with somebody I don't know very well, it's much safer, it's much better to do the serial facilitation. But there's a few people that I work with where we're reading each other's mind, and we have kind of a unspoken language as we're doing co-facilitating or co-presenting that allows it to feel like it's an improv approach, where you're always adding to and creating a setup for the next person and inviting them in. So I think it's knowing both is important.
I would say too, yes. And I think both are jazz. right? So if you're playing jazz, sometimes you have a group that has that synergy and that you can play off each other and all of that kind of stuff. And in a jazz group, often they'll pass those solos around, right?
Right.
So it's, John gets to do the bass solo, and then someone gets to do a drum lick, and then somebody gets to do, the saxophone solo and all that kind of thing. Like that's very much part of the jazz tradition as well. And I think facilitation can be that way too. You're passing off like who has the solo and who's kind of running the thing. But the other person isn't just like checked out when they're doing that. They're observing and they're asking questions and that kind of thing, and they're maybe jumping in with can I add something, or can I ask a question here, and then you start to riff off each other and that kind of thing, and that builds great co-facilitation as well.
Yeah. So before we jump into facilitation, one more question about your journey, and I want to hear a little bit about what has been your biggest or most challenging transition, and more professionally, but I think transitions, you can't talk about a transition professionally without talking personally. So tell me a little bit about your biggest challenge in a transition and kind of the ways that you have managed it, or you could be in one right now. And what are your tactics for managing transition?
So transition has been the story of my life since about 2015. And I think that first transition was probably the most difficult, professionally and personally. So in 2015, it became obvious to me that I could not stay in the position I was in. We could go into the reasons why, but that's a whole nother episode, I think. So I left the position I was in the position that I not only was in, but the position I really thought I was going to be in for the rest of my career. I thought that I could stay in this place and really make a difference there and really kind of influence how that organization moved forward and all that kind of stuff. And I loved the work I was doing. I loved, with very few exceptions, I loved the people I was working with. And so when it came time to leave, that was just a very difficult decision to make in the first place. And it was a difficult transition to transition out, because I had my fingers in every pie there was just about in the organization. The other thing that made it very difficult was that I had something lined up that fell through my last day in my job.
Oh,
Yeah, it was rough. It was a rough day. I was saying goodbye to all my friends, and I got this phone call. I can't remember if it was a phone call or email that said, yeah, so thanks, but no thanks. And that was a crushing blow, because it was an organization that I'd always wanted to work for. And I thought I was, on my way. So that was very difficult. And personally, it almost felt like leaving a bad relationship, like divorcing. Even though it might have been an amicable divorce, it was still, I had to separate myself from this job. It was part of my identity. It was part of, a big part of who I was. And it was all the people I was hanging out with as well. So that was really difficult. And it took a long time for me to figure out what my next step was. And I took a couple steps that I thought were going to be great, and they turned out not to be great. And once I questioned why they weren't a good fit, that led me to a question that became really important. And the question was, what am I curious about?
Mhm.
What could I think about, research, maybe write about, or do and learn more about for the next, 10 to 20 to 30 years of my career? What am I curious about? What do I want to know more about? And once I formulated that question, finding the answer to it led me to everything else. And it wasn't, I didn't find the best thing right away or anything like that, but it did lead me along a path of, well, is it this that I'm curious about, or is it that? And it turned out that facilitation was what I was curious about. And that led me to all kinds of other adventures.
Well, and I love that question. What am I curious about? Because I've said this before on this podcast, which is Paul Simon was being interviewed by Dick Cavett, and he said he was stuck. And if you know background about Paul Simon, he never really is stuck. But Dick Cavett asked, so what does it mean to be stuck? And Paul Simon said, well, I'm stuck when any path I take doesn't lead me to where I want to go. And then really what it is continue to take the paths. And that's the curiosity piece. And so I love that, because that's not an ending question. I think it's not just what you're curious about, but what do you continue to be curious about? It's like, I think, because you and I have this passion about understanding facilitation, and facilitation is such a big hairball of a mess to try and understand, that you can always continue to dive in to it's a complicated thing, but you can appreciate its complexity. And that leads to a great transition into, like, you're doing a lot of thinking about facilitation now. So tell me where that's going.
So as part of my master's degree, I had an assignment to do a literature review. And as part of that, you formulate a question, and it should be a question that you can find some literature about the answer to. And I was curious about facilitation. And part of my work has led me to be curious about facilitation and teaching, partly because when I work with teachers, and especially when I work with people in higher education, the term facilitation isn't really used. And the other thing is, part of my journey, when I figured out that I was curious about facilitation, I was like, okay, I want to be a facilitator. Let me get a job in facilitation. So I put into, Indeed and LinkedIn and all those things, facilitator. And the things that came up were like Six Sigma facilitator, and Myers-Briggs facilitator, and Scrum Master, and like all these things. I'm like, that isn't, I mean, I probably could do those things. I'd have to pay someone to get certification, which that's a whole nother thing. But that's not really what I want to do, I don't think. But what they meant by facilitation was a little different from what I meant by facilitation. I had just facilitated an adventure at that point.
Well, so and that sounds like a lot like when I went into the corporate university and I said, I'm a facilitator. And I got the questions, oh, what process do you facilitate? Is it Six Sigma? Is it Agile? Whatever those is. Or I got, oh, you're a facilitator? So why aren't you in project management? Because you would facilitate projects. Or, right. Oh, you're a facilitator? Why aren't you, do you help like manage travel and facilitate travel? And I'm like going, same thing of, well, wait a minute. There's more to this facilitation thing than my understanding, which was adventure and experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, okay, wait. And so I kind of poked around and I found the International Association of Facilitators. And they have a whole competency model and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't know, this sounds really intense. And this is not necessarily what I do, but I think I'm good at what I do. Yeah, so that just kind of threw the door open. And then when I talked to people in education, they were like, I said, well, I want to study facilitation in teaching. And they're like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, well, facilitation. They were like, no, we don't know. We don't know what that means. So I was like, okay, well, I need an answer to that question. What do I mean by facilitation? So that led me to my question for my research for my master's. And it turned out to be 4 questions. So my 4 questions were, what does it mean to be a facilitator? Or what does it mean to facilitate? What does it mean to teach? Where do they overlap? And where are the gaps? So to answer those questions, I found facilitation competency models, which John helped me kind of figure out that language even, and that led me down a whole big, opened up a whole floodgate of research. And I looked at teaching competencies as well. So I compared, I think it was 4 competency models and 5 teaching models. And I found where the commonalities were in the facilitation models and in the teaching models. And then I compared them to kind of a third model, a lot of models.
Yeah.
And then I compared them to each other. So it was a whole big process of comparing and kind of calculating things. I assigned each one a value of certain kind and that kind of thing. And then I compared and I came out with a chart. And looking at that chart was just so interesting.
What were some of the things? First of all, for people who are entering into master's or PhD programs, you've got to really love your topic, because by the time you get done with your research, not so much. But
Yeah.
tell me some of the insights that you gained from that comparison.
So there were so many. So the first insight was, for me personally, how much they overlap. So when I did my student teaching eventually in science, I entered the classroom and I thought, I am going to knock this out of the park. I've been working with kids for the last 2-3 years. I know how to manage a group of kids. I know this, I know the material. This is going to be easy peasy. It was not. Using facilitation skills outdoors in a camp when those kids have come to you is very different from using those skills in a box of a room with desks and chairs in a classroom that was set up by somebody else. So that was a challenge, and it wasn't what I expected. And since I did my student teaching has really changed and shifted. And my premise was, well, teachers just need facilitation skills on top of the skills that they have. Well, it turns out that a lot of those skills are very, very similar. We all set up an environment where people can change and learn and grow. We all do that. Some of the ways that facilitators think about doing that are slightly different from the way that teachers are taught to think about that. And I think that's valuable for teaching. But I think it's also valuable for facilitators to think about when and how teaching might be what they're after.
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up, because when I train facilitators, one of the first things I ask is, what are you facilitating? Because to facilitate means to make easy. And most adventure facilitators, they challenge course and they put things out there for people to overcome. But you are still, what are you facilitating? I say we're facilitating growth or learning, or if you're facilitating a model, you're facilitating that model, making it easier. You do it by creating an environment where learning can happen. And that environment, you're trying to teach math, you're trying to facilitate math learning. Well, you're trying to make learning math easier, but you do it by giving them problems. Right. And you give them these ways to practice and overcome. But I love that you describe what both teaching and facilitating has really heavily relies on creating an environment.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the teaching competencies really focus on, so when we're facilitating, like your question is a good one. What are we facilitating? So you may be facilitating growth, but that may not always be the goal. You may be facilitating a process of, it may be a process of change in some way. It may not necessarily be personal growth. It may not necessarily be learning. It may be figuring out how we're going to start with this set of stuff we have to work with and get to this product, for example. Whereas in teaching, the goal is always learning. That's a key difference, I think, between facilitation and teaching. In teaching, it's very focused. The goal is always student learning. Whereas in facilitation, it can be, well, we're facilitating an experience. Maybe that experience involves growth, maybe it doesn't, but it's an experience, right? So that's, I think it's a commonality, but it's also an important distinction. The other thing that we have in common is our own professional growth. Those things are important both to facilitators and to teachers. So there's the model that I compared both facilitation and teaching to is the communities of inquiry model. And they have 3 presences that they say make a good educational experience. The teaching presence, the cognitive presence, and the social presence. And I was surprised at how many of the teaching presence items existed in the facilitation models as well. And those have to do with planning and our professional growth. So planning the lesson or the thing that you're going to do, planning for time and space, and also understanding, maintaining and seeking out knowledge about the profession of either facilitation or teaching. Whereas, and then teachers have additional ones, understanding and applying content knowledge and assessing and evaluating learning. Facilitators don't necessarily have those as outcomes. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. And again, that's just the difference between being a teacher in an environment that's focused on learning, whereas being a facilitator, and it could be a variety of environments.
Yeah. Well, and I understand your, I mean, the context of your master's was an adventure experiential education program. And that's where I would say, like, the definition of facilitator that you're using is really about experiential and adventure facilitators, and not so much when you talked about Agile and Six Sigma and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So actually, when I compared my facilitation competency models, I was using models from business facilitation, government facilitation. It was mostly business facilitation and adventure facilitation. So I had 4 or 5 models. Yeah, and they were all business. Game simulation was another one. So business, game simulation, and education or adventure. So they were from various different things. The other thing I identified when I was done with this whole project is the fact that it would be fascinating to put more kinds of facilitation into the mix and figure out what things were common among all of those. Because there's facilitation in medicine, there's facilitation in government, there's all these different kinds of things.
Well, and that's when I was like putting together a facilitator training approach. For me, because I went into the business world and corporate learning, it became important that I find, like, what is that big picture of facilitator competencies? And as I worked in like the training world, it was like they didn't have very much around the adventure aspects of the power of adventure, about not knowing outcomes and treating it as a process that leads you someplace. Even when I did a little bit of training in Six Sigma, a little bit of training in a bunch of different models and approaches and assessments and things like that. And the tools that you get from doing experiential and adventure facilitation, man, they bring a lot more when you're doing these other types of facilitation, and vice versa. Man, my eyes were wide open in understanding that, again, facilitation, when I talk about it and talking about making things easier. So I describe what I do is I design experiences and environments for I design experience. I design environments that facilitate growth. For me, it's about growth. But for like when I'm doing a creative process, innovation, I talk about what I'm doing is I'm designing an environment and an experience that's going to facilitate innovation. And it's going to facilitate. So all these different things, when you're facilitating, you need to think about, what am I trying to make easy? And this is where you take it out and like you take the facilitation chunk into teaching content and allow it to be an adventure where you're creating an environment and an experience that facilitates applying mathematics or biology concepts or things like that. And for me, and I love the fact that you're stepping into teachers who like already have a lot of these skills. And I think the insights that you bring help them take skills they already have and see them in a new way.
Yeah, and that's really, as a consultant, as a person who wants to help people learn how to create and what's my what's my whole catchphrase? Create and leverage teachable moments. That's what it's all about. It's teachers have skills. There are other skills that they need in order to be more successful, especially considering in K through 12 world, the curriculum is really demanding that they facilitate learning rather than teaching very didactically. So the other thing that was really interesting was that I found some gaps in between facilitation and teaching. So there were some things that showed up in teaching competencies that didn't show up in facilitation at all. And there were things that showed up in facilitation that didn't show up in teaching. So there's quite a lot of those. I can walk through some of them. So there are a couple that stood out to me. One was there was a competency that showed up in every single facilitation model. And I think it was the only competency that did. So these facilitation models didn't agree with each other a whole lot. So there were a bunch of things that didn't show up in some of them. But this one showed up in every single one, and that was understanding yourself. That did not show up in any of the teaching competencies. Which I thought was just so interesting. And it really, it made me harken back to my foray into the classroom. My student teaching was in middle school. And I think a lot of teachers might agree with me that stepping into middle school as a teacher just brings you right back to your experience as a middle school student. And my experience as a middle school student was terrible. It was really, really difficult. And so those first few months in that classroom, I had to really sort through my own, I don't know, middle school trauma, maybe you could call it. I mean, it was difficult.
I think people would be comfortable calling it trauma in middle school.
Yeah, middle school is just, it's hard for everybody. Nobody gets out unscathed, I don't think. So being a teacher and being in that classroom, when you're triggered by things that are happening that the students are doing, you as the adult, you need to be the calm, cool, and collected one. So you need to know yourself. You need to know what's going to trip some things that are going to maybe not be so great for you as the adult in the room. So that was just so fascinating to me that that's not something that teachers are really expected to do.
Well, what's interesting to me is now there's a big push in education for social emotional competencies, emotional intelligence, all that, which is at its core is self-awareness and then self-management. But they're all about teaching the kids about that. It's hard to do if you're challenged in that area yourself.
Very, very much. The other thing, so as I've been introduced to some brain science along the way in the last few years, part of the, I think, what do you call it? Gifts of the pandemic, I think is what you said, something like that. So I realized that we talk about our students being dysregulated and how we get them regulated. Well, you can't do that unless you are regulated yourself as the adult in the room. If you are not regulated, you are not using your cortex to reason. And so you cannot reason through the best actions to take with this child who is dysregulated. So you have to know yourself. You have to know what's going to trigger that, and you have to know how to get through it yourself in order to be the functioning adult in the room. So that
their triggers will trigger your triggers. So
right, exactly. Yes, yeah. And if you're alone in a classroom with 30 kids, boy, you better know what you're doing as far as that goes.
Well, and that brings, like, there's this probably my favorite book about teaching. I got because when I was in my master's program, I'd go to another school that was nearby and I'd look at the classes that I was taking at their school and look at their books. And one book I got was one called To Know As We Are Known, The Spirituality of Education by Parker Palmer. And what he brings up in there is that teaching is the loneliest profession, even though you're with people all the time, because it's you solo with your students and your colleagues are all in other classes. And the idea of that, he wrote this back in the 70s, and this idea of a community of learning or a community of inquiry, he kind of generated that thought and this idea of making sure that you stay connected and that the school builds in systems where teachers are connected. The other thing he highlights is this idea between the idea of to know as we are known is this idea of not only know your students, know yourself, know the content, and look at that dynamic of relationships all the way around. So you are trying to bring your students into a relationship with the content, not just know the content, but in relationship. You do that by fostering relationships between the students, between you and the students, between yourself and the content and the students. And I really love that image that Parker Palmer brings out in the Know as We Are Known.
I love that idea. And there's so much research about the relationship between the students and the teachers. Students learn from teachers they have a good relationship with. There's just such a huge body of research about that. I'd like to explore what the body of research is about the relationships of students with each other. I think there is some out there. I haven't explored it myself, but I think there's quite in my experience, that relationship makes a difference too. And that gets a lot less play. It gets talked about a lot less. I think principals will say, establish good relationships with your students, but they don't talk about establishing good relationships among the students between each other.
Yeah, the phrase connection for content has become really popular in the last couple of years. I mean, it's an old phrase, but first of all, my pushback is if it's just content you're offering, send them the slide deck. Because what we're really doing is connection before process. And there's a lot about facilitator or teacher connection with the participants. But I think what we've learned over the past few years is that it's really creating connection between each other, everybody in the room, not just it's between the participants and the facilitator, teacher, students. All those relationships is what's going to bring it forward. And if you get that, your process, whatever you take them through, is going to take them that much further through it. We learned this when I was doing corporate leadership. We would do a team day. Very first thing, they're there. We bring supervisors in first time for a week, and we take them out to a park, and we would do. We called it the field day or park day, and really it was sequenced activities for about 6 hours in the park, of some unique and typical challenges and some unique challenges for that group. And I got pushback saying, do we still need to do this full day? And I pointed out that we were teaching about team building, not in the sense of building a cohesive group, but when supervisors get together, team building is about assembling a staff. It's about recruiting, hiring, evaluating, and bonding and all that kind of stuff. So we were teaching that stuff out there through experience, but because they were challenged together and they actually bonded as a class, we got further in all our other topics. So while we took 6 hours, it was an investment to go further every day on the different topics that we put out there.
Absolutely. One of the things I've done over the last few years is think about facilitation and think about what I mean by facilitation. Even before I started this research about competencies, I was thinking about it for myself. And one of the kind of tenets of facilitation that I adhere to is go slow to go fast. So that's that principle of build those connections, build those relationships, build those processes at the beginning, and then you can go much faster with your content, with whatever else you're going to do, if you have those connections to start with.
Yeah. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question. When you talk about facilitation, what's your simple definition of facilitation?
I don't have a simple one, but I do have 6 skills that every facilitator needs.
Okay.
Those 6 skills are go slow to go fast, manage risk, sequence with intention, observe closely, question genuinely, and be open. So I hit an interesting point when I did my research as well. So I researched all these competencies, right? And I figured out, all these things that, do they work together, and what are the gaps and what are the overlaps and all of that. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, none of this is in my model. But then I realized that all of it is in my model. So, for example, we talked about the fact that both teachers and facilitators need to set up an environment where people can create and learn and grow, right? The 6 skills that I've identified are the way you do that. So for every one of the competencies that there are for facilitation, these 6 skills are the route to get there.
Yeah, and like your model isn't just an overlay of competency models. It's
right.
It's a way to contain the complexity of all these competency models into 6 easy insights.
Yeah, and it's a way of, for me, hopefully going forward, it's going to be a way to think about how I teach facilitators to do what they do. So I've been doing that the last probably 10 years now, without having identified these things in this way. And I think this is going to make it much more easy for me to talk about, well, when somebody asks me, what do you mean by facilitation? This is what I mean, these 6 skills, and then I can identify how these are different for facilitators than they are for teachers, for example, or for other professions. Because teachers ask questions, but they ask questions in a different way than a facilitator does.
Yeah.
The other thing I think I can do now that I've done this comparison of the competencies of a facilitator and the competencies of a teacher is, as a trainer, I can put them together. And I have a much better idea, because as a trainer, in the adventure world, I'm training on skills, and there are skills that I need to see and I need to assess. So I need to have a teacher hat on a lot of the time. I also need to facilitate, because part of what I'm doing is building a group of staff who are going to be working together to accomplish something that's greater than themselves. And so I have to have that facilitator hat on as well. So I need to know when to kind of change hats. Or when I'm doing something that's both.
Yeah, and I totally agree that when you're doing training, and this is just like a classroom, there are times when you are using teacher competencies. There's other times when you're facilitating, like to me, when you train skills, you're actually facilitating a process that is skill development. But then you turn teacher when you're both giving the foundation to those things, but also when you start to evaluate the skills, and you're teaching them the lessons or the academics behind those skills. Then you facilitate the skill building, and then you assess and evaluate the acquisition. So yeah, I mean, to me, that's why this is why I think what you're going towards, every classroom teacher needs to know the facilitation aspect of, and I think it's very wise for every facilitator to know how to teach. For instance, if you're getting people into harnesses or you're doing safety procedures, those types of things are true teaching.
Yes,
that piece
and
of it.
And you better be doing your assessment well to know if that harness is put on correctly.
Yes.
Like there are things like in facilitation, we like things to be open-ended. We like them to be open. We like them to be, that kind of squishy thing. But when you're teaching something, there's an evaluation process, and there are standards to which you need to be held. Yep. And if you're a trainer, or you are doing something that requires like safety procedures, those need to be set to a standard, and you need to know what that standard is. You need to be able to assess it, and you need to be able to say what to do when the standard has not been met. Yeah. So as a trainer, I can't say, oh, it's okay, I think you'll learn it down the road or whatever. I have to assess and say, nope, you have not learned this skill, and I can't let you be in charge of people to do this.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how that harness is on, but why don't we try?
Right. Yeah.
Hey, we're coming up to the end of our time here, but I got a couple of like rapid fire questions. So, I'm going to ask a question. You're not going to like sign a contract on your life on the answer. It's just whatever comes up first. So the first one is, I can frame it in a couple ways, but what is your favorite book to gift somebody? What's your favorite book that you give as a gift?
So the one that has been the most impactful for me, and I recommend it to everyone, and I give it to everybody I know, is called "What Happened to You" by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah. It can change everything for it. It was so impactful for me, and other people have shared that it's really changed a lot for them too.
Oh, cool. Now, I know this next question is probably a whole bunch of people to choose from, but who are your heroes? Maybe one or two of the people who are heroes in your life.
Oh gosh, you're right. There's a lot to choose from. Um, heroes. Yep, there's a lot to sort through. One of my heroes is Michelle Obama. She's one of those people who does things with intention and does them well. And looks darn good doing it.
Yeah. All right. One more of the rapid fire here. Who or what do you find yourself quoting most? And it could be a significant book or song or whatever, or it could be Seinfeld or Friends, but what quotes do you hear coming out of your mouth most frequently?
Oh, I'm going to fly my dork flag high up here. Monty Python quotes come out of my mouth probably most often than anything else.
Okay, which Monty Python? Because there's so many good ones. Which one comes out most?
It's got to be the Holy Grail. I spent a chunk of time in college watching the Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail every day. And so that's just a part of it's ingrained in how I talk now.
Is there a specific line that comes out, or is it it's contextual?
It's contextual, yeah. A random "neat" will just escape, from time to time.
Yeah. So I've got actually a friend of mine had a copy of the script for Holy Grail. There's the original script, and then they took it from what actually was said, and they spell out "knee," and also this is because it's heavily improv. But it's just hilarious how it changed over, and then only a flesh wound. I think there's so many people who quote that not knowing where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yep, probably.
Yeah.
Yep.
So now we don't only have camping in our background as a formative part, but we also have Monty Python as well.
Absolutely.
Well, Lucinda, thank you so much for spending this time. I think we could go on forever just geeking out over facilitation and flying our dork flag about that. So thank you for sharing your insights, your research, and that your curiosity is still moving you forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, John. This has been great.